200,000 Irish children. The number hit me before the ships did. Before the missing manifests. Before the orphanages that appeared overnight with no construction permits. 200,000 children, most between the ages of 4 and 14, who arrived in New York Harbor with their families between 1845 and 1855, and then simply vanished from all official records within 2 decades. That's not immigration loss. That's not assimilation. That's the entire population of a major city's children just erasing from the census, from church records, from school registries, from every document that should have tracked their existence. To put this in perspective, if every Irish child who landed at Castle Garden and later Ellis Island between 1850 and 1875 had grown up, married, and had families in New York, the Irish population of the city should have been roughly double what it actually was by 1880. Demographers have noticed this gap for over a century. They call it the Irish demographic anomaly. But no one talks about where those children actually went. Or how they left. Or why there are no ship manifests recording their departure. I wasn't looking for this story. I was researching famine ship mortality rates in a maritime archive in Boston when I found a customs document from 1851. It listed 47 ships that departed New York Harbor between March and November of that year bound for Quebec, Montreal, and various ports in the American South. Standard commercial traffic, except for one notation in the margin, written in different ink, possibly added later, juvenile cargo, documentation waived per mayoral discretion. Juvenile cargo. Not passengers. Cargo. And the documentation was waived, which means there's no record of how many children were on those ships, who they were, or where exactly they were going. That single document led me into 2 years of research that keeps circling back to the same impossible question: how do you lose 200,000 children? The official story goes like this. During and after the Great Irish Famine of 1845 to 1852, roughly 2 million Irish immigrants fled to America, with the majority landing in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Many arrived sick, destitute, and traumatized. Irish families crowded into tenement housing in neighborhoods like 5 Points in Manhattan. Mortality rates were brutal, particularly among adults weakened by starvation and disease. Typhus, cholera, and tuberculosis killed thousands. Many children were genuinely orphaned. Charitable organizations, both Catholic and Protestant, established orphanages to care for these children. Over time, as Irish immigrants assimilated and achieved economic stability, the children either remained in New York, joined family members elsewhere in America, or were placed with adoptive families through early social welfare programs. Some returned to Ireland once conditions improved. The Irish population in New York grew steadily through the late 19th century, and today, millions of Americans can trace their ancestry to those famine-era immigrants. It's a story of survival, resilience, and the immigrant experience. That's what you'll read in textbooks. Let me be fair to that narrative. Much of it is accurate. The famine was real. The death toll was catastrophic. Irish immigrants did face horrific conditions in New York. Orphanages did exist. Some children were placed in loving homes. Many Irish families did assimilate successfully. I'm not disputing the broad strokes of Irish American history. But when you drill down into the actual numbers, the paper trail, the institutional records, and especially the gaps where records should exist but don't, the story starts to fracture. Not collapse, exactly. Just reveal itself as incomplete. Like a map where entire regions are marked terra incognita, not because they were unknown, but because someone decided not to fill them in. Let's start with the numbers, because they're staggering even before you notice what's missing. Between 1847 and 1860, approximately 1.5 million Irish immigrants arrived at the Port of New York. Passenger manifests from that era, preserved at the National Archives and the New York Public Library, show that roughly 35 to 40% of passengers were children under the age of 16. That gives us somewhere between 525,000 and 600,000 Irish children entering New York in just 13 years. Now, factor in the mortality rate. Adult mortality among Irish immigrants in New York during the 1850s was roughly 20 to 25% in the first 5 years after arrival, according to public health records from Bellevue Hospital and the New York City Health Department. Child mortality was lower, around 12 to 15%, because children who survived the Atlantic crossing were generally hardier. So let's be conservative and say 15% of those children died in New York. That's still 450,000 to 510,000 Irish children who should have been alive and living in New York by 1860. But here's the problem. The 1860 United States Census recorded approximately 203,000 people of Irish birth living in New York City, and only about 68,000 of those were under the age of 16. Even if you account for children born in New York to Irish parents, which the census categorized separately as native-born of foreign parentage, the total number of Irish children in New York in 1860 was around 95,000. That's less than 20% of the children who should have been there based on immigration records. Where did the other 400,000 go? Did they move to other cities? Some, certainly. Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and other cities had Irish populations. But when you add up the Irish child populations in every major American city in 1860, you still come up short by at least 200,000 children. They're just gone. Not in the census. Not in church records. Not in school registries. Not in orphanage logs, most of which were destroyed in fires or consolidations over the following decades. Just absent from history. I found this while researching something else entirely. A ledger from the Immigrant Industrial Savings Bank, which served the Irish community in New York and kept meticulous records of depositors. Irish families opened accounts to save money for passage, funerals, or to send remittances back to Ireland. Between 1851 and 1865, over 30,000 Irish families in New York had active accounts. But here's the strange part. In nearly 4,000 of those accounts, there are entries for child passage fees or juvenile transit costs withdrawn between 1852 and 1870, with notations like emigration assistance or relocation fund. But there are no corresponding passenger manifests showing Irish children leaving New York during that period. I cross-referenced departure records at the New York Maritime Museum. Ships left daily for Boston, Philadelphia, southern ports, Canada, even back to Ireland. Manifests exist for most of those ships. But the manifests listing children separately, especially Irish children, are almost entirely absent. Either the ships didn't keep records of juvenile passengers, which violates maritime law even by 1850 standards, or the records were removed. The ledger is sitting in a filing cabinet at the New York Historical Society. You can request to see it. But the manifests it references don't exist anymore. Speaking of records that don't exist, let's talk about the orphanages. Between 1848 and 1860, at least 17 Catholic orphanages and 23 Protestant orphanages were established in New York City specifically to house Irish famine orphans. That's 40 institutions appearing in just over a decade. The New York Foundling Hospital, the Mission of the Immaculate Virgin, the Protestant Half-Orphan Asylum, the Association for Befriending Children and Young Girls, and dozens more. Construction permits, property deeds, and incorporation documents exist for some of them. But intake records, the daily logs that should list every child's name, age, arrival date, and departure information, those are largely gone. The Archdiocese of New York claims many records were destroyed in a fire at the Chancery Office in 1899. Protestant organizations cite similar losses in various warehouse fires and floods. Maybe that's true. Fires happened. But the timing is almost theatrical. Most of the record destructions occurred between 1895 and 1920, right when progressive-era reformers and journalists started investigating child welfare institutions and asking uncomfortable questions about where all those Irish orphans had gone. But here's what matters. Some records survived. Not many, but enough to reveal a pattern. A historian named Margaret Lynch Brennan studied New York foundling hospital records in the 1980s and found fragments of intake logs from 1853 to 1857 in the basement of a closed facility in the Bronx. What she discovered was troubling. Roughly 60% of children admitted were listed as orphans, but the intake notes included phrases like mother living but unable to care, father at sea, parents in almshouse, or family requests temporary placement. These weren't orphans. These were children whose parents were alive but poor, sick, or temporarily unable to house them. The expectation, according to Brennan's analysis, was that parents would reclaim their children once circumstances improved. But the discharge records, the logs showing when and to whom children were released, those pages are missing. Just torn out. You can see the binding stubs. Someone physically removed the evidence of where those children went. Let me be fair to the people running these institutions. Many were nuns, priests, and charity workers who genuinely believed they were saving children from starvation and disease. The conditions in 5 Points and other Irish neighborhoods were brutal. Child mortality, while lower than adult mortality, was still significant. Placing children in institutions or with families outside the city could have been seen as rescue. That worldview was common among both Catholic and Protestant reformers of that era. But good intentions don't explain the scale of the disappearance or the systematic destruction of records. And they don't explain the ships. Which brings me to the ships nobody recorded. In 1854, a New York Times article, buried on page 7 of the November 12 edition, mentioned in passing that several vessels have departed this month carrying juvenile emigrants to agricultural placements in the Western Territories and Canadian provinces under the auspices of various charitable societies. The article didn't name the ships. It didn't specify how many children. It didn't list the organizations involved. It was 2 sentences in a paper that regularly ran 10-page editions. Why so vague? The Times kept detailed shipping news. Arrivals, departures, cargo manifests, passenger lists. But for these particular ships carrying Irish children, nothing. I searched the Times archives for the entire year of 1854. There are 6 similar mentions, always brief, always vague, always lacking specifics. It's as if someone was required to acknowledge the departures but forbidden from documenting them fully. The timeline isn't subtle. The peak years of Irish child disappearances, 1851 to 1865, coincide exactly with 3 major historical developments. First, the expansion of American agriculture into the Midwest and West, which created massive demand for farm labor. Second, the growth of Canadian timber and railroad industries, which also needed labor, including child labor, which was legal and common. Third, and this is the part that keeps me up at night, the escalation of tensions between Protestant and Catholic communities in New York, which included widespread fear among Anglo-Protestant elites that Irish Catholic immigrants would overwhelm the city's cultural and political institutions. Removing Irish children, either through adoption, indenture, or outright trafficking, served multiple agendas simultaneously. It provided labor where labor was needed. It reduced the visible Irish population in New York. And it offered opportunities for Protestant organizations to save Catholic children by raising them in Protestant households, which was openly discussed in religious publications of that era as a moral good. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. Maybe the missing manifests were just administrative incompetence. Maybe the destroyed orphanage records were genuinely lost to fires. Maybe the demographic gap is explainable through internal migration that simply wasn't recorded well. Maybe the bank ledger entries for child passage fees referred to families moving together, even though no family manifests matched those transactions. Maybe the vague newspaper mentions were just stylistic choices by editors who didn't think child emigration was newsworthy. But here's what I can't explain: why are the records still sealed? The Archdiocese of New York holds orphanage records from the 1850s and 1860s in its archives, but access is restricted. You need written permission from the Cardinal's office, and requests are routinely denied. I applied in 2022. I was told the records are protected under privacy statutes, even though everyone involved has been dead for over a century. What privacy is being protected? Speaking of privacy, let's talk about what happened when Irish families tried to find their children. There are dozens of documented cases, mostly found in letters preserved by local historical societies and family archives, of Irish mothers and fathers searching for children they had placed temporarily in orphanages or sent away with promises of return. One letter, dated 1862, from a woman named Bridget O'Sullivan to the Mission of the Immaculate Virgin, reads, "I write to inquire after my daughter Mary, aged 7 years, whom I placed in your care in January 1860 due to my illness. I am now recovered and employed. I have written 4 times with no reply. Please inform me where she is so I may bring her home." The letter is in the archives of the Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany. There's no record of a reply. There's no record of Mary O'Sullivan in any surviving orphanage logs. She just vanished. That pattern repeats over and over. Parents searching, institutions refusing to provide information, children disappearing into what one 1867 letter from a priest in Boston called the Western Placements, which was apparently a euphemism for anywhere that wasn't New York. Some children were placed through the orphan train system, which I know has its own deeply problematic history. But the orphan trains, run primarily by the Children's Aid Society, didn't start moving children in large numbers until the late 1860s, and they kept at least some records. The Irish child disappearances I'm talking about happened mostly in the 1850s and early 1860s, before the orphan train system was fully operational. These were different ships, different organizations, different networks. And unlike the orphan trains, which at least left a paper trail scholars can argue about, these earlier movements left almost nothing. I don't have answers, only patterns. A massive influx of Irish children. A demographic gap that can't be explained by mortality or recorded migration. Orphanages with destroyed intake and discharge records. Bank ledgers showing payments for child passage with no corresponding manifests. Vague newspaper mentions of juvenile emigration with no details. Families searching for children and being stonewalled by institutions. And contemporary accounts, buried in religious publications and charity reports, openly discussing the removal of Irish Catholic children from New York as a social good. Maybe each of those things individually is explainable. But together, they suggest something more organized than chaos. Something more systematic than tragedy. Something that served economic and cultural agendas that no one wanted to document too explicitly. There's a phrase that appears in several Protestant charity reports from the 1850s, rescuing children from the influences of popery and poverty. That's not my interpretation. That's a direct quote from an 1856 annual report of the American Female Guardian Society, which operated several orphanages and placement programs. The idea that Irish Catholic children needed to be saved from their own culture and religion, and that removal from their families and communities was an act of charity, was openly stated policy. Combine that ideological framework with economic demand for child labor and a legal system that gave enormous power to charitable organizations with almost no oversight, and you have the conditions for mass child removal. Not kidnapping in the legal sense, because it was all authorized by institutions with legal standing. But removal nonetheless. Permanent, undocumented, and irreversible. The last documented attempt by an Irish parent to locate a child removed by a New York charitable institution was in 1923, according to records at the Irish Immigrant Society. A man named Patrick Brennan, who had placed his 2 sons in an orphanage in 1867 after his wife died, returned from work out west to reclaim them in 1869 and was told they had been placed with a family upstate. He spent the rest of his life searching. He placed ads in newspapers. He hired a lawyer. He contacted every Catholic parish in New York State. He never found them. His letters, dozens of them, are in a collection at Fordham University. The desperation in his handwriting, the way the script gets shakier as the years go on, is almost unbearable to read. He died in 1924, still searching. His sons' names were Michael and James Brennan. If they lived, if they had children, there could be grandchildren alive today who have no idea their grandfather spent 55 years looking for their father. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The missing manifests are real. The destroyed records are real. The demographic gap is real. The contemporary accounts of child removal as cultural policy are real. What we choose to call it, how we frame it in the comfortable distance of history, that's still being negotiated. But the bones of the story are in the archives, scattered across a dozen institutions, sealed behind access restrictions, or simply gone. 200,000 Irish children came to New York. Most of them never appear in records again. Some found new lives. Some probably died in ways that were never documented. But some, maybe many, were systematically moved out of New York through networks that left almost no trace because the people running those networks knew that what they were doing, while legal and even celebrated at the time, might not look so charitable if examined too closely a century later. The ships existed. The children were on them. But nobody wrote down where they went. Or maybe somebody did, and then somebody else made sure those records burned.